In the shadow of Donald Trump's goading, and there was more of it this Monday, Canadians casting ballots in a general election. Tariffs and talk of making the world's second largest nation in size the 51st state, flipping the momentum from the opposition Conservatives to Liberals who had been suffering from incumbent fatigue after a decade in power. That is until 99 days ago. Starting on Inauguration Day in the U.S., Trump's belligerent tone stunning his neighbors to the north. We'll ask about former central banker Mark Carney, who stepped in and called the snap vote after unpopular predecessor Justin Trudeau bowed out. What's the plan for a nation unsure about the lasting damage in relations across the world's longest unprotected border? And what to make of rival Pierre Poilievre, who hails from the right wing of the Conservative Party. The MP from Ontario was actually born in Alberta, the oil-rich western province often depicted as Canada's answer to Texas. And the most sympathetic to Trump. Is Canada polarizing the way the U.S. has? What identity for a proud member of the Commonwealth, whose head of state to this day remains Britain's monarch? The fault lines in politics had long been between Anglophones and the sovereignists of French-speaking Quebec. How to explain this change? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at Canada's border problem, and with us, Alan Woods, journalist for the Toronto Star newspaper. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks as well to entrepreneur and consultant Tanya Heath, who hails from the capital, Ottawa. How are you?
That's right. Very good, thank you, and happy to be here.
From Montreal, Guillaume Lavoie, lecturer at the Quebec National School of Public Administration, also associate member at the Raoul Dandurand Chair of the University du Québec in Montreal. Welcome back to the show.
Oh, great to be with you.
And from London, Ontario, Moshe Lander, senior lecturer of economics at Concordia University. Thank you for being with us.
Hello.
You can, by the way, listen, that's right, listen, like and subscribe to the France 24 debate wherever podcasts are streamed. Talk about a wild swing from 20 points back on the day of Donald Trump's inauguration to a relatively solid Liberal lead. It's been a roller coaster ride in the polls, with disruptions all the way to the end. What with tragedy marring the final weekend of campaigning, a car ramming in Vancouver, overshadowing events. Charlotte Lamb has more.
At this Vancouver church, the Filipino community prays for those killed when a man drove into a crowd at a festival on Saturday. Prime Minister hopeful New Democratic Party leader Jamit Singh meets with locals a day before Canada's federal election. Candidates paused their campaigns briefly to pay respects before continuing their rallies across the country, ahead of a ballot centred largely on US tariffs and President Donald Trump's threats to annex Canada. The current Prime Minister and Liberal Party leader accusing his American counterpart of rupturing global economy.
They want our country. There's your answer. There's your answer. Because Canada is not America.
Before wrapping up his campaign on a somber note.
I think we draw on that at this incredibly difficult time in solidarity, in comfort and grieving, to unite in a common purpose.
Carney's rival, the leader of the Conservatives, once described as Trump-inspired, has centred his campaign on the cost of living and ending woke ideology.
All of our hearts and prayers are today with Canada's brilliant and proud Filipino community. We will restore our freedoms, repeal censorship, honor the people who came before us, end cancel culture.
The opposition Conservatives just a few months ago had a 20-point lead in the polls. Experts predict the party could lose to the Liberals, thanks to Carney's tough stance against President Trump.
Alan Woods, it's not just Canadians that are watching this, it's the whole world now that's watching this election.
Yeah, as often said, that it's sort of a generational moment for Canada being in the world headlines, in the international headlines. It doesn't happen often. And we're having one of those moments where everyone's looking to Canada. Foreign Minister Melanie Joly, before the election, when Trump announced his tariffs, said Canada's sort of the canary in the coal mine for basically the world in terms of the tariff policies. And I think everyone's looking to find out what happens now after our election result comes in.
All right, and again, this election day, Donald Trump taking to social media and making a 51st state jibe. How will that play with voters?
I think it's going to have the same effect that it has had all along. It's going to sort of underscore the argument that the parties are making that we've got to oppose the U.S. Tariff policies. I think it's going to help Mark Carney, who's in that prime ministerial role and has been able to sort of remind people that he's a leader and also a man sort of uniquely experienced for this job in this moment, which is his selling point.
Guillaume Lavoie, which way is the wind blowing? I know there was heavy turnout when it came to early voting.
It's a trend, though, that early voting is gathering more and more voters because it's also more convenient. But I believe Canadians generally are quite engaged in this election because it's more than just choosing your government on domestic issues such as cost of living or housing, which were quite important. But this election has become perhaps a new lesson of politics, which is he who wins is not who's got the best answer, but who answers best the questions that matters most to voters. And that's perhaps what explains this great turnover in terms of basically this is an election, a referendum on Donald Trump and who's best equipped to deal with
because
on his tweet today, by the way, I think that given that no party is even inclined to doing Trump's bidding, the result will be a resounding answer that Canada doesn't want to play that game at all.
Yeah, because there's, as you're alluding to it, there's national unity when it comes to pushing back against Trump's pronouncements.
I would say very much so. There are two, since the very inception of Canada, there were always two sort of core issues or top priorities for anyone who's Prime Minister of Canada. First one is national unity. It's a country that spans a continent, that's multicultural, that it's bilingual. So that's always been, and I think always will be, a very difficult needle to tread. And the second one is dealing with the Americans, dealing this relationship with a giant as our neighbor. And those two top priorities have been merged into this election, where defending national unity and dealing with the U.S. has become the very same one major question. And perhaps Donald Trump has united Canada far more than anyone before him. And he's united, perhaps he's recreated or rekindled a national sentiment greater than I haven't seen in, I would say, more than a few decades.
Tanya Heath, dealing with Americans, that's something that Canadians think about generally when they go to vote, or is that new?
It's obviously something we don't think about. I remember back in the days when I used to work with the D&D, which is our Department of National Defense, we didn't even really have a contingency planning for dealing with either invading or being invaded by the United States. I think that has absolutely profoundly changed. I think if you listen very clearly to Carney at the moment, so our current Prime Minister, just from the symbolism perspective, visiting France and the UK before visiting Washington, it's never been done before. Calling into question the purchase of F-16s and talking about Eurojet or maybe even a Rafale, I hope so.
Rafale fighter jets.
Maybe it would be, say, maybe second choice. And looking for other trade partners, other strategic partners. This is all uncharted territory. And if I talk to my friends in Ottawa, they use a very hard language. They talk about the enemy. For my friends in Ottawa, there's no doubt in their mind that we're at war, which is fascinating.
At war?
Yeah. So that was fascinating. The number of people who consider that a trade war is war by another means was absolutely huge. And yesterday, preparing for this debate, I was talking to a lot of my friends in Toronto, and they're saying Toronto is practically in paralysis at this moment. Business decisions are not being made, and there's a complete lack of clarity on how to move forward. So I believe today is very important on the one hand. I believe Canadians very quickly understood that the threat was new. And I think that very quickly tomorrow, whoever is elected will have to bring the provinces together. And that's one of the good things. The provinces will probably come together. So interprovincial trade barriers are scheduled to fall in July.
That's an important point. Moshe Lander, economic growth in Canada has underperformed the last few years. And one of the reasons people say is because, well, the trading between the various provinces doesn't always go smoothly.
Yes, we have a lot of interprovincial barriers that could be different regulations. Of course, the language laws in Quebec are themselves a barrier to trade, where English companies have to face different packaging and language requirements. But in oil-rich Alberta, the idea of getting a pipeline built to the West Coast or to the East Coast and being able to ship oil and gas to Europe and break its reliance on Russia, or to Asia, which is energy starved, is difficult because pipelines, when they cross provincial barriers, are a federal matter. But oil and gas and natural resources are provincial matters. And so you see these barriers that pop up. And one of the studies that we've seen is, if you take a look at a Canadian province and its trade with a neighboring province versus a neighboring American state, the American state actually gets better trade relations than with the neighboring province. And so the thought of trying to remove these barriers at least is maybe a temporary holdover until we can figure out how to find greater trade partners in Europe, in Asia, and try and figure out what's going on in the US, because this is something that was completely unforeseen for the last 80 years since the creation of the GATT, the forerunner of the World Trade Organization. Canada and the US were original signatories, and the creation of the Auto Pact, which was the forerunner of the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, which was the forerunner of the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was the forerunner of the current Mexico-US-Canada Free Trade Agreement. We've always moved in one direction with the Americans, which is towards deeper integration, less barriers, and more economic prosperity for both sides. The thought that Trump could say these things, let alone mean these things, is the ultimate knife in the back for Canadians. And you've seen a wave of patriotism, like some of your other guests are saying, that we have not seen in a long time. Even Quebec, which has its strong sovereignty streak through it, is, at least by voting intentions, firmly on board with the idea of Team Canada.
And this moment of national unity, let's push that a little bit further, because we saw Canada's the second G7 country to vote since Inauguration Day in the U.S. Germany, immediately after voting, they got rid of their debt brake because they knew that they were going to have to spend a lot more on defense without the Americans backing them up, most notably. So let me ask you, Moshe Lander, will that same sort of national unity exist once all the ballots are counted on issues like you were saying, the trade between provinces?
I'm not as confident that it's going to exist in the coming weeks. I think that the bottleneck, which has traditionally been Quebec, is in fact going to be Alberta. They have really brought a lot of grievances to the table, some real, some imagined. And I think that the political disconnect between a fairly right-wing government in Alberta and the center-left government of Trudeau and now Carney does not jive well with a lot of Western Canadians. And so they've made demands that within the first 100 days, they want to see clear commitments from the federal government to try and help Alberta get its oil and gas to market. And we've heard previous politicians out of that province even strike the phrase of dissolution of Canada or separatism for Alberta. And we're seeing a little bit of common cause these days between the premiers of Alberta and Quebec, almost like strategizing for what can we do jointly. So I don't know how much this will necessarily carry over. I think partly the election results tonight will dictate that. If the Liberals win as they're expected to, if they win a majority as they're expected to, and if it's sizable enough, and if they can make some headway in Alberta and Saskatchewan, which is next door, also very heavily mining dependent, then that might be the type of thing that can at least bring them to the table, and they can continue to blame Ottawa for their problems while they tacitly go along with it, realizing that it is good that Canada is united.
Alan Woods, Alberta is the new Quebec?
Well, listen, I interviewed Stephen Harper, former Prime Minister Stephen Harper, back in 2005, 2006, right before he became Prime Minister. And he, at that time, said, if I don't win government and the Liberals are re-elected, there'll be a national unity crisis like you've never seen in Alberta. So, I mean, this is something that it's sort of a perennial thing. It comes up from time to time.
Why? Because they have outsized power because of all the natural resources they have in Alberta?
Because the resources and the wealth are there, and the decisions are made somewhere else. And there's that lasting and sort of long-standing grievance.
Guillaume Lavoie, where you're sitting in Montreal, we're getting reports that sovereignists are perhaps thinking twice before voting for Le Bloc Québécois. Instead, perhaps thinking maybe I'll vote for the Liberals just to make sure that Trump is doesn't get his wish.
Yes, the sovereignist vote has always been in an awkward position when it comes to a federal election. All that being said, it's important to note for your audience that the sovereignist in Quebec is not a marginal fringe. Their party has formed governments at least 4 times already. They are, according to the polls, they could form the majority government at the next Quebec election. We're much closer to a Scotland or perhaps formerly Catalonia situation as something marginal and insignificant. But what's really at stake here is a discussion as to what kind of Canada should we have. And sovereignty might be an answer to change the balance of power. But there's a lot of people in Canada, in Quebec, and in Alberta, and in Ontario formally as well. Because in Canada, one should know that Canada does not belong to the federal government. The provinces are an equal and sovereign level of government. And it's a legitimate and Canadian position to argue that perhaps there's too much governing at the federal level and not enough at the provincial level. And to rebalancing this is as fundamental and as old a debate as Canada itself. So that will remain. And of course, Alberta feels that it has always felt that the country is governed in the East for the Easterners, and then there have grievances that need to be addressed. And perhaps this is one of the greatest misstep of the Trudeau government, is having governed as if the western part of the country didn't exist enough. And so all those issues will be there still. And one can argue that there should be more governing at the provincial level without making this a conversation about weakening the country as a unit itself.
Oh, so Guillaume, let me ask you, because the trend in Western politics has been towards splintering of the vote, but polls suggest that smaller parties this time could feel the squeeze. Here you see the makeup of the outgoing parliament, most notably the left-wing New Democratic Party could be battered. So if we're back to the old big tent parties, the Liberals and the Conservatives, how does that mesh with what you're saying in terms of the decision that Canada has to make with that balance between regions and the federal state?
That's always been there. What helps perhaps this, not return, but this stronghold on a two-party system is that in Canada we have a British parliamentary system, a first by the post system, which tends to favor parties ready to govern, rather than having a bizarre coalition that only takes a known shape after the election. And in a matter of crises, the parties who have credentials as could govern the country, in Canada, the Conservatives or the Liberals, tend to sort of suck all the oxygen out of the room. But you could have Conservative Party that would want a stronger provincial governing as well. The federal government is responsible for not that many things. And let me just give you Canada 101. The federal government spends money on programs, provinces, and people. The provincial governments in Canada operate the day-to-day government, schools, justice, healthcare, So the governing of the day-to-day is very much at the provincial level, and the federal government is basically a distributor of funds. So should those funds come with conditions, I guess the conversation, given the threat, will be the federal government is responsible for international trade, international relations, diplomacy, the military, where the federal government hasn't done a good enough job. Donald Trump is right on this one. There will be, I think, a recentering of priorities on the very things the federal government should be dealing with in the first place, rather than trying to overstep their boundaries into perhaps more vote-seeking, popularity-seeking, provincially run jurisdictions.
Yeah, and whoever is elected next has their work cut out. The Trump administration, not just the president himself. If it was just him on social media, you might think it was having a bit of a jibe. But we heard, for instance, Donald Trump's Secretary of State on Sunday.
I think the president has stated repeatedly he thinks Canada would be better off as a state. And he has said that based on what he was told by the previous prime minister, who said Canada can't survive unless it treats the U.S. unfairly in trade.
Right.
So this is something they're seriously studying, Tanya Heath.
I think it's a serious concern. I think, Canadians on the one hand are very aware that if we did become the 51st state, we would be the fourth poorest state. So if you look at our economic growth since 2019, since the pandemic, we have consistently lost ground. In the OECD, our productivity rates have gone down. So there's a lot of alarm in Canada, and there's a lot of reasons that people were really very dissatisfied with the Liberals and thinking of voting for the Conservatives. So that's on the one hand. But then on the other hand, the whole thing is absolutely absurd. What astonished me, I was joking with my billionaire friends, will you send out the welcome wagon and will you be happy to be American? And part of me was thinking, I've been in France for 30 years. Part of me was thinking, sure, they'd love to earn more money. And what I've been absolutely flabbergasted by is the resurgence in patriotism and also the re-relevance of Canada. If you'd asked my children, who are now in their 20s, if they were Canadian even a year ago, they'd be like, pas vraiment. It wasn't something they were proud of. But ever since Trudeau's speech, where he specifically addressed the trade imbalance and the threat to Canada, the kids have become proud. And then I'd say the last thing that's been decisive in this election is the very strong stance that Carney took. So Carney is like, we're going to fight this. And everybody in the entire world is asking themselves, how do you deal with Trump? Like, do you compromise? Do you talk? If you speak to people in finance, they're all about compromising and talking. But if you speak to politicians, it's not clear. And what are we seeing? We're seeing Canada stood up, and we weren't included in the Freedom Day, 2nd of April tariff war. So we were excluded from that. That's an interesting point.
Why?
Why? Because I think we showed a bit of teeth, because Canadian civil servants work in a very organized way. So I heard about, the dissing about federalism. But one thing we would do is we would look at Republican controlled areas in the United States and apply our reciprocal tariffs to those areas. So we would go for absolute maximum damage wherever possible. And I think that Canadians really, really want their government to show teeth. So a real debate today, as Canadians go to the polls, will be partly what strategy is better. Is it better to defend this notion of Canada, or is it better to discuss?
Okay, so Moshe Lander, here's a hypothetical for you. The Trump administration has reportedly been considering whether to rip up treaties governing management of what amounts to 20% of the planet's fresh water supply. I'm talking about the Great Lakes. Here we're seeing beautiful images of Lake Huron. How would Canada react if these treaties that share the management of these waterways were ripped up?
Well, the whole idea of these agreements is that they've been agreed upon, that we recognize the benefits that accrue to both sides of the border by having these agreements. So whether it's on trade, whether it's on fresh water, whether it's on the border itself, there's a clear understanding that trade benefits both sides. The problem with the U.S. administration narrative is that they're not presenting facts correctly. They're skewering them, they're misrepresenting themselves, and that's not surprising. We've heard Trump himself talk about fake news. He is the ultimate origin of much of the fake news. So if there's an attempt to try and rip these up, it's not because that the U.S. feels that it's getting a bad deal. It's because Trump feels that he's getting a bad deal. And that's because he fundamentally misunderstands what trade is all about. It's not a zero-sum game. It's that both sides gain from this relationship that we have there. The risk, of course, to Canada is that a lot of that water that the Americans are after is on our side of the border. And so what exactly are they prepared to do by ripping up these agreements? Are they prepared to come take it? Are we actually talking about using a force, which is something that Trump, the politician, said, I think back in late 2024, that he was prepared to use force, and then he said economic force or whichever is necessary. And that's the type of thing then that would be very worrisome to Canadians because even the amount that we do spend on defense in relation to GDP is probably not enough to withstand the Americans. And I don't know that our allies would necessarily jump to our defense to defend us against the Americans. So what exactly comes into play there is unimaginable. We haven't had a conflict with the Americans for over 200 years, and we weren't really Canada then. We were a British colony at that point.
Alan Woods?
This is a great point. This is the ultimate problem here. It's one thing to promise that we're going to do things in an election, we're going to build, we're going to transform our economy, and we're going to reorient towards Europe or towards Asia. It's another thing to do it. And it's not something you can do in the term of a single term of a government, 4 or 5 years. It takes 10 years, it takes 2 generations, it's a long-term sustained effort. And so what happens in 4 years when Trump, in theory at least, is gone from the White House, and there's maybe a Democrat, maybe someone who's more amenable to Canada, who's got a nicer face? Do we abandon all the things that we're promising and planning to do now? What is the long-term plan? And does the Canadian government have the wherewithal to stick by that plan?
Stick by the plan because what you're saying is that once the trust is broken, you can't put it back together?
Well, exactly. And we're looking to establish relationships with other countries in Europe, for example. Well, Canada has a plan to. It's a NATO country, obviously. It wants to increase military defense spending. It's one of the lowest defense spenders by GDP right now. In 2 or 3 years, it wants to get up to the 2%. Well, Europe's already going towards 3% and 4% and 5%. So Canada is still going to be the laggard internationally, even in a couple of years. So it's really, it's going to take someone, a leader, prime minister, government, maybe several governments, to keep their eye on the ball for many, many years for this transformation to actually bear fruit.
All right, and as was mentioned earlier by Tanya Heath, Mark Carney's first foreign trip as Prime Minister last month was right here to Paris before going to London. This at a time when the French and the British are trying to cobble together, speaking of the military, a coalition of the willing to keep up support for Ukraine without the United States.
We both stand for sovereignty and security, demonstrated by our unwavering support for Ukraine under your leadership.
Today, as we see these principles being rejected by more and more governments around the world, it's more important than ever for Canada to strengthen its ties with reliable allies like France.
Okay, Prime Minister of Canada, by the way, still has to be bilingual, even though he's from Western Canada. How's his French?
His French is probably as good as mine.
Okay. Well, but let me ask you more broadly. The war in Ukraine, with Donald Trump accused at times of using the Kremlin's talking points. Mm-hmm. And you just heard the challenge posed by Alan Woods about how the Canadians can level up. Listening to Mark Carney in that clip, what's your thought?
I think, the reality is much more dire than people say. So we have 68,000 troops, all services put together. So I would give us no chance of even being able to hold Lake Superior. That's the reality. Then there's this notion of time. I think that the invasion of the Ukraine has proven that when push comes to shove, you can move quickly. He also brought up, and I think quite astutely, a notion of leadership and vision. Once again, crisis does tend to provide both. So I would be in agreement with the fact that it does take time. I think it's possible. I will say at my humble level, I am, kind of like an ex-Canadian. I've been in dormancy for 30 years here in Paris. I have a shoe company. Yet, out of the woodwork in the past 2 months, more and more French companies are asking me for my advice on how to do business with Canada, specifically in strategic areas. And this to me is astonishing because I did not change my LinkedIn profile. So I think it's possible. And I think necessity is really the mother of a lot of policy and a lot of invention.
Guillaume Lavoie, is this something you're experiencing in Montreal? People who might have gone to the U.S. for business or for research, who are taking a second look at Canada instead?
Well, you see that from the polls amongst researchers, for example. Even in the United States, people looking at McGill University or the University of Toronto, every crisis provides opportunities, and this one will provide it too. And the rest of the world will see the Canadian experience as well as a lesson. For example, if Donald Trump behaves as such with one of the longest allies, Canada, with whom it had a trade relationship and a free trade agreement that he himself signed in his first mandate. So why in the world would any other country read his behavior and thinking that it's very important to sit down with Donald Trump to have a deal, which he would likely not respect or live by or obey by? I'm not sure that time is on Trump's side, more and more so. So perhaps what we see in Canada will replicate itself in other places, that the world needs to rethink itself as coalitions without having the United States as the key or a central pin partner of it. And this is a transformation of what we've seen since the Second World War. But I think Canada was due for a shakeup on domestic issues, on governance, on military, budget. It is inadmissible that we are, as a member of NATO, don't pay the conditions of entry of membership. On that level, our defense position is indefensible. So perhaps in the long run, we would have seen this as the shakeup Canada needed, and perhaps the rest of the world too.
Alan Woods, just a quick question on this, because Canada's the country that sent fighters in World War I to fight in the plains of northern France, that was on the beaches of D-Day. Why is it that there's this, that the spending hasn't kept up on defense?
Because we can rely on the United States to defend the continent. Quite frankly, that's what it is. I mean, they set up their distant early warning line in our Arctic, their radar system to protect against Soviet missile invasion if it would ever come. We've been the very, very junior partner in the defense of our continent, just because we can. And there's been less and less purpose. We had some purpose when we were in Afghanistan, when our military was in Afghanistan. That ended a bit ambiguously, and really it's sort of been grasping for purpose since then. We found some in Ukraine, where we're defending part of the NATO's eastern border in Latvia, but militarily, we've been laggards.
Moshe Lander, again, I talked about the Germans earlier, who've decided to go back on fiscal purity to fund their leveling up militarily. What would it take for Canada?
I'm always amazed when we talk about these things like 2% of GDP, 3% of GDP and spending on military. I think that just a dollar amount by itself is the wrong approach. It's the complementarities of what we're spending on. And so to Alan's point, Canada traditionally until the 21st century were the peacemakers. at least since the Second World War. So we were often the blue helmets that would go in and just try and hold the peace, maybe playing to Canada's identity as non-confrontational until the last couple of months, at least. And so we were viewing the Americans as, well, you're the ones that go and make war and that deal with that. And then we come in after, and we don't need to spend necessarily on weapons and security. We're there to make sure that everybody's playing nicely together. And so that requires a different type of spending, even beyond just the dollar amount. Now the idea that we need to spend a certain number of dollars to satisfy the Trump administration, again, is missing the point. It's that we don't need to replicate what they're doing. If they're spending on high-tech, cutting-edge equipment, do we need to duplicate that? And if we're spending those dollars, is that really going to give us credit for that? Or should we be spending our money elsewhere on different parts of the military-industrial complex? When we have these conversations with NATO, when we have the conversations with our EU friends and allies, this is not the thing that comes up. So if the Germans want to spend more money, that's certainly their right. But are they spending money that's going to complement the existing infrastructure of Europe, of NATO, or are they merely duplicating it? One's a complete waste of money and shouldn't even be a conversation point. But it seems to be the thing that obsesses a lot of us when it comes to military spending.
Tanya Heath?
I would disagree with some of those points. Our spending's been weak. Our ability is catastrophically weak. Alliances have shifted very strongly and very quickly. And as has been pointed out by somebody else, if Canada was invaded tomorrow, absolutely nobody would come to our defense. I think we have to look very clearly at what our needs are. So is protecting the Arctic something we care about? Is it one of our needs? Is there a cheap way of protecting us? Can we go forward with our assumptions? So about a month ago, there was a lot of talk about would Canada be booted out of Five Eyes? And that's very important because there's an enormous amount of SIGINT intelligence.
Five Eyes, the intelligence sharing.
Only for signals, but that's very important because that picks up a lot of chatter and that has kept a lot of countries safe. So Canada, spending definitely, I would say, has to increase. There has to be a complete and quick strategic review, and we have to move forward with that.
Let me ask you, Moshe Lander, one other question on this. In 2019, the French Parliament approved a free trade agreement that the EU signed with Canada. It's called CETA. Last year, the Conservative-led French Senate rejected ratification. Now, with the new administration in Washington over here, the governor of the Bank of France earlier this month penning a letter where he urged the government to change its reasoning and to push for those free trade agreements. Would a free trade agreement, what would it change, a free trade agreement between Canada and the European Union?
Well, it depends if it's an actual free trade agreement or if it's merely a free trade agreement that's on paper, because you can imagine that in France, in Canada, things like farming, agriculture immediately start getting carve-outs. There's an entire group of protectionists out there. They're going to say, well, we totally agree that we should be trading automobiles and oil. It doesn't extend to farm products. And so each country in Europe is going to have its prize carve-out. Canada as well. You've seen it over decades with the European Union and how part of the project has stalled because you can't necessarily get agreement in services or in environmental standards or labor laws. And so these things are the equivalent of the interprovincial barriers that I was talking about a few minutes ago that exist in Canada, but now they would just be at the national level. So is there truly a commitment to removing these barriers? Is there a commitment to stand up to French farmers and yellow jackets and saying, hey, this is for the greater good? The role of the government is to make sure that you receive some of those benefits and you're not left behind. But the fact is that we're not going to continue to protect you anymore. If that's really what's going to happen, then this is an amazing opportunity here. Canada does not have to become a member of the EU, something that was floated as maybe a theoretical idea more than a practical idea. But it is certainly something that we have a lot of neighbors in Europe that have historical ties to, many Canadians who will trace their ancestry back to Europe and will find common cause in democracy and the basic founding principles of Canada and much of Western and Central Europe.
Guillaume Lavoie, you agree?
I believe it's an amazing opportunity. And this has been in the works for years now. I think some 20 years ago, I was an intern at the Canada-Europe Roundtable for Business based in Brussels. And item number one was trying to put a free trade agreement between Canada and the EU on the table. Now, we're much further ahead. And I can tell you that the Canadian provinces, who have an enormous say in such a deal, are very much at the forefront and pushing forward on it. And even if it's not going to be on everything and perfect, as no free trade agreement truly is, it sends a very powerful signals to investors, to market developers, that it creates not only a bigger market or a bigger opportunity of a bigger market, but it creates a predictable environment for investment. And this is perhaps, it's also a political signal that's very strong. This was in the way, and there were still a few hurdles to overcome, the French Senate being one. And perhaps, again, Trump here becomes the shake-up and wake-up a lot of us, not Americans, needed to perhaps move to the next step.
All right, Alan Woods, one last question here, because you've had in the last few years, foreign meddling has come from various quarters. There was the high-profile assassination of a Sikh separatist leader in Vancouver. There was your newspaper, the Toronto Star, reporting this week on one of the local elections for MP where the Chinese are accused of meddling. Elon Musk, with his platform and all of that, is that the biggest threat, as polls seem to suggest? That's the perception right now, that the United States is the biggest foreign meddler in this election?
Yeah, it's certainly, it's true. It's that's the perception. That's one of our sort of most celebrated intelligence experts, academic, wrote a big long piece about how this is the threat. It's unprecedented what the Americans are threatening to invade or annex or some people take Canada away and make it a 51st state. It's unbelievable. People cannot understand how it's got to this point. And how it can continue. It can continue because we've got a president in the White House who doesn't really respect the laws, doesn't respect the laws in his own country. So why would he respect a treaty from ages ago that's going to divide up the Great Lakes? There's this lack of trust, and it's real.
It's real. We'll leave it there for now. Alan Woods, I want to thank you so much. I want to thank Tanya Heath, Guillaume Lavoie for being with us from Montreal, Moshe Lander from London, Ontario. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.
Thank you.